Can you believe that an entire civilization, one that had stood for thousands of years and built monuments so massive they defy physics even today, could be wiped from the face of the earth in a single, terrifying blink? This isn't history as you know it. This is a ghost story, told in the teeth of a coming storm. A chronicle of the moment when the lights went out for the ancient soul of Britain, and a brutal, shiny new world was forged in fire and copper. We are talking about the moment, the quiet, earth-loving farmers who worshipped the great circular henges, the people who had meticulously hauled the bluestones 150 miles across the landscape, simply vanished. They didn't evolve. They didn't merge. They were replaced with a shocking, almost impossible speed, leaving behind only the cold silence of their megalithic temples. Imagine the year 2500 BC. Britain is green, dominated by massive, silent stones. The inhabitants, descendants of the first Neolithic pioneers, live in relative harmony with their ancestors' sacred earthworks. Their technology is flint, wood, and bone. Their greatest treasures are the bones of the long dead, revered in communal tombs. Then, a shadow falls over the sea. It wasn't a slow migration. It was an invasion of culture, a genetic tsunami that changed the entire island's destiny overnight. The scientific evidence is terrifyingly clear. Within a few short generations, the indigenous population of Britain saw a staggering 90% replacement of their genetic lineage. 90%. That is not assimilation. That is extinction on an unthinkable scale. The culprits, they emerged from the European mainland, not as massive armies, but as small, highly organized and lethal bands of individuals, known to us today by the distinctive, beautiful pottery they carried, the Beaker people. They didn't just bring pots, they brought the ultimate disruptor, the secret weapon that would redefine power, wealth, and violence for 2,000 years: metal. They sailed across the choppy, perilous waters of the Channel, landing on shores that knew nothing of smelting, nothing of alloying, nothing of the deadly, beautiful shimmer of gold. They were the masters of fire, the alchemists who could pull hard, usable wealth from the very bedrock of the earth. The native people, who saw value only in sacred stone and the cyclical rhythm of the harvest, must have watched in awe and then in terror as these newcomers casually transformed dull, heavy rocks into gleaming, sharp, permanent status symbols. Can you believe the psychological impact? It would be like watching someone casually pull laser weapons from thin air today. This was the dawn of the Bronze Age, and it was a catastrophe no one saw coming. The Beaker warriors were different in every conceivable way. They buried their dead not in communal long barrows, honoring the collective spirit of the tribe, but individually in isolated graves, accompanied by their personal weapons and tools of power. They were the first great individualists, the first true celebrities of the British Isles, demanding eternal recognition for their deeds, not the deeds of their ancestors. Their graves were packed with high-value goods, archers' wrist guards, intricate bone V-perforated buttons, and most crucially, daggers of shining copper. Their speed was relentless. Historians are still reeling from the speed of the transition. It took the Beaker culture less than 300 years to completely dominate the genetic landscape of Britain, setting up new trade routes that would link the island's resources, the vast copper deposits of the West and the tin of Cornwall, to the emerging mega-networks of Europe. Suddenly, the quiet corner of the world, once famed only for its massive, inexplicable stone circles, became a necessary cog in the machinery of global ancient warfare and status. The British Isles were no longer the sleepy end of the continent. They were the source of the ultimate military resource, the perfect alloy. But to truly understand the Bronze Age, you must understand the terror of the trade. Copper is soft, beautiful, but soft. Tin, however, is the secret ingredient. Combine just 10 parts copper with 1 part tin, and you create bronze, a metal exponentially harder, sharper, and more resilient than anything known before. And where was the only major, reliable source of tin in all of Western Europe? You guessed it, Cornwall. This geological quirk transformed isolated Britain from a Stone Age backwater into a geopolitical superpower, destined to fuel the ambitions of every emerging chieftain from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea. The power brokers of this new era weren't the priests or the farmers. They were the prospectors and the smiths. These metal workers who understood the magic of the forge became the new elite, draped in gold ornaments and carrying the weight of the island's future on their shoulders. They controlled who lived and who died, who starved and who prospered, all based on the shimmering power of the metal they commanded. Think of the Amesbury archer, the king of Stonehenge, buried just miles from the great monument. His grave was not just rich, it was decadent. Over 100 grave goods, including gold hair ornaments, the oldest gold artifacts ever found in Britain, and multiple copper knives, indicating immense status and wealth. He wasn't even British-born. Scientific analysis of his tooth enamel shows he grew up somewhere near the Alps, likely Switzerland or Germany. This wasn't local talent rising up. This was international, high-value immigration, drawn by the promise of British tin and copper. The sheer audacity of these early Bronze Age movements is breathtaking. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles, crossing mountains and seas, carrying the secret technology of metalworking, just to settle near a marshy, cold stone circle. Why? Because the stone circle itself was still the center of power, the sacred nexus the new rulers sought to co-opt and control.
They didn't tear down Stonehenge, they redefined it. They stopped hauling the massive blue stones and instead began placing massive cremation burials around the site, effectively claiming the ancestral grounds of the replaced peoples as their own. The megalithic tradition was violently hijacked, repurposed for a new age of individualistic, terrifying power.
This is not the history of sleepy shepherds tending flocks. This is the history of ruthless innovation, genetic replacement, global trade wars fought over mineral rights, and the dramatic, sudden transformation of a peaceful island into the arsenal of ancient Europe. The stage is set for an epic 1,500-year drama of wealth, ritual murder, and eventual total collapse. Get ready, because the British Bronze Age is about to reveal its sharp, shocking truths. The dust settles over the emerald fields of Britain, but the silence is misleading. Beneath the surface, the greatest cultural and genetic purge in recorded history has just completed its savage work. 90% of the indigenous lineage, the great Neolithic builders who raised Stonehenge, are gone, vanished like mist at dawn. The survivors, if any, now live under the cold, ruthless shadow of the newcomers. These invaders, whom we label the Beaker people, didn't just bring new pottery. They brought a new, terrifying concept of power. They were the ultimate disruptors, arriving not just with bows drawn, but with the shining, deadly promise of metal. This was the true engine of the conquest, the ultimate status symbol, the reason the old gods fell silent. Imagine a world where the sharpest tool is flint, meticulously knapped over hours. Then, suddenly, a stranger arrives holding a heavy, gleaming copper axe. A tool that never dulls, a weapon that strikes fear into the heart. The copper itself was not native to Britain. It had to be imported, linking these new lords to vast, powerful networks stretching across the continent, instantly giving them an economic lever no previous chieftain had ever wielded. They understood value, they understood scarcity, and most importantly, they understood the terrifying effectiveness of a short, sharp dagger forged in fire. These daggers, found prominently in the graves of the new elite, were not simple tools. They were declarations of dominance, defining the warrior class in this nascent age of bronze. The entire structure of society cracked wide open. Where the Neolithic farmers buried their dead communally in great cairns, emphasizing the collective spirit, the Beaker lords demanded singularity. They were buried alone, often crouched, surrounded by their personal armaments and drinking vessels, shouting their individual greatness to the heavens. We see this dramatic shift most clearly in the astonishing artifacts recovered from places like the Amesbury Archer, a burial so rich it redefined the British early Bronze Age. This man, likely arriving directly from Central Europe, was not just wealthy, he was militarized wealth personified. He was interred with over 100 objects, gold hair ornaments, the first gold ever seen in Britain, copper knives, flint arrowheads, and the stone wrist guards designed to protect the forearm from the snap of a bowstring. This wasn't just a farmer or a community elder. This was a warrior king, a man who commanded loyalty through the threat of superior weaponry and conspicuous consumption. These archer graves are scattered like warning beacons across the landscape, marking the domains of the new ruling families, families whose power was rooted in mobility and the control of these precious, exotic metals. They didn't just take power, they weaponized status. And what of the mighty monuments of the old world? Did the Beaker people simply tear them down? No, they did something far more insidious. They claimed them. They repurposed the ancient sacred geometry of sites like Stonehenge, bending the powerful ritual energy of the past to serve their new, ruthless present. It is during the initial Beaker occupation, around 2500 to 2300 BC, that the monumental final phase of Stonehenge is undertaken. The great sarsen stones, hauled miles and meticulously dressed, the ambition, the vision, belonged entirely to the Beaker hierarchy. This was not an act of reverence for the old ways. It was a terrifying demonstration of centralized power. We are strong enough to command the earth and the heavens, the stones silently screamed, and if you defy us, you face the copper blade. But copper, for all its revolutionary impact, was flawed. It was too soft. A copper dagger quickly bent. A copper axe lost its edge after heavy use. The early Bronze Age was, ironically, mostly the Copper Age, defined by frustration and constant repair. The true chemical secret, the formula for genuine, hardened bronze, the metal that would sustain an empire for 1,000 years, lay in a perfect, almost mystical pairing: 90% copper and 10% tin. Tin was the missing ingredient, the element of immortality. It was rare, difficult to find, and necessary to turn the soft, frustrating red metal into the hard, golden-brown alloy that could truly dominate warfare and industry. The desperate search for tin would soon define the next phase of the Bronze Age, driving explorers, warriors, and traders to the furthest, darkest corners of Britain. They needed Cornwall. They needed the western mines, sources of the purest metal the known world had to offer. And the moment they found it, the entire island would transition from a collection of scattered tribes to a fully integrated, trade-dependent, massively wealthy, and utterly ruthless Bronze Age society ready to explode onto the European stage. The stakes were no longer just survival. The stakes were metallurgical superiority. And the blood that needed to be spilled to secure that tin was already drying on the blades of the Amesbury archers' descendants. The true Bronze Age was about to begin its long, glittering reign of terror. The ancient forests held their breath, waiting for the clanging sound of war that only true bronze could produce. It was a sound that meant absolute power, absolute control, and absolute crushing wealth. Get ready for the age of the Axe Lords. The axe lords didn't just bring the blueprints for the lethal weapon. They had to secure the supply line, and the stakes could not have been higher. Britain, suddenly, was no longer just a collection of remote islands defined by ancient gray stone. It was a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open, its resources now the beating heart of a continental economy. The discovery of the perfect ratio, 9 parts copper, 1 part tin, was not a mere scientific breakthrough. It was the birth certificate of an empire built on metallic terror, signaling the irreversible end of the Age of Stone. Copper was relatively accessible, scattered across the mountainous spine of Wales and the peaks of Cumbria. Though still requiring back-breaking, dangerous labor and cramped, torch-lit tunnels, operated by a new class of subservient laborers. But the true secret ingredient, the magical element that hardened soft copper into the lethal, ringing metal we call bronze, was tin. Tin was rare, almost mythical, concentrated with brutal geographical precision in the extreme southwest corner of the island, Cornwall and Devon. This was the bottleneck of civilization, the choke point of the entire new system. If you controlled the tin deposits, you controlled the entire socio-military apparatus, from the Scottish Highlands down to the English Channel. Every axe lord, every burgeoning chief, knew that the greatest wealth wasn't measured in herds of cattle or piles of grain, but in the unquestioned access to those glittering alluvial deposits of tin ore, dragged from the earth like stolen precious jewels. The trade routes, which had been slow and meandering in the Neolithic past, now exploded in violence and urgency, marked by armed escorts and fortified staging points. Suddenly, this small piece of the world, barely known outside of its immediate neighbors a century prior, was the central hub of a European trade network stretching across the sea to Brittany, down the Atlantic coast to Iberia, and deep into the mainland continent. And from this crucible of resource control, genetic dominance, and unprecedented metallic flow, a new, terrifyingly wealthy elite emerged in the heartland of Britain. Historians call them the Wessex culture, due to the location of their spectacular burials, but we should call them what they were: the high kings of the early Bronze Age, the absolute masters of the New World Order. These were not simple tribal leaders arguing over grazing land. They were industrialists, military commanders, and dynastic rulers who claimed divine right, reigning supreme over a system perfected by generations of Beaker dominance and sustained by the power of the axe. They didn't live in huge, towering palaces. Stone buildings were still reserved for the long-dead ancestors, but their power was undeniable, inscribed in the landscape itself through massive earthworks and guarded mines. The ultimate, shocking proof of their reign lies in a burial mound barely a mile from the silent, ancient majesty of Stonehenge, Bush Barrow. When this massive, turf-covered tomb was excavated in 1808, what lay inside was not just a body reduced to dust, but a fully articulated manifesto of absolute
crushing control, preserved beneath the soil for millennia.
The chief buried there, known simply as the Bush Barrow Man, was interred with such spectacular, staggering wealth that it immediately rewrites everything we thought we knew about early British society. Forget the rough flint knives and simple pottery bowls of the Neolithic era. This man slept in death with the tools of conquest, ritual, and dazzling, conspicuous display.
He was accompanied by 2 perfectly crafted bronze axes, sharp and heavy, clearly meant for ritual execution or wartime command, their edges gleaming even after 4,000 years. Next to them lay a magnificent bronze dagger, its hilt not merely carved, but intricately inlaid with thousands of tiny, microscopic gold studs, showing off a mastery of metallurgy that borders on the impossible for this supposed primitive time.
But the most shocking element, the element that screams high-status power across the centuries, was the gold itself. He wore a massive golden belt hook, a gleaming crescent of hammered solar metal, designed specifically to catch the harsh sunlight and declare his status and lineage from across a sprawling valley. And then there were the famous gold lozenges, thin plates of beaten gold, intricately decorated with repeating geometrical patterns, so precise they suggest the use of complex tools, perhaps even early protractors or specialized carving implements. These weren't common currency. They were pure statements of power, art pieces of unimaginable value. They were proof that this man, this lineage, controlled not only the Bronze Age supply chains, funneling tin and copper to the workshops, but the entire network of luxury goods flowing into Britain from distant, exotic shores. They had access to the rich gold deposits in Ireland, the high-quality copper from the continental mountains, and, most crucially, the precious tin of their own home turf, tightly guarded. This intense, almost reckless level of display was not about mere survival. It was about defining the uncrossable chasm between the axe lords and the desperate common farmer, who still scraped a meager living with wooden tools and poorly made stone axes, never touching the gleaming bronze. The landscape itself had to bend to this new, militarized hierarchy. Stonehenge, that ancient, silent monument of the vanquished Neolithic peoples, was suddenly and ruthlessly repurposed. It was no longer the sole focus of spiritual worship, but it became the ultimate, intimidating backdrop for the Wessex elite and their massive funeral rites. The massive stone circle, now centuries old, became the funeral parlor and the spiritual headquarters of the richest Bronze Age chiefs, who buried their dead right next door, claiming the history and the profound spiritual power of the land for themselves through the sheer weight of their wealth. They didn't waste time building new stone circles. They simply hijacked the most powerful existing one. It was the ultimate, calculated power move, standing on the shoulders of the Neolithic giants, literally, and claiming their heritage as their own divine, metal-fueled right. The true Bronze Age had arrived, not quietly, but with a golden, terrifying, and utterly crushing roar, and the island of Britain would never look back. The dust settled on the greatest demographic cataclysm Britain had ever known. The megalith builders, the astronomers of Stonehenge's first phase, the people who had carved their lives into the landscape for thousands of years, were gone. Their memories submerged beneath a deluge of new language, new customs, and a terrifyingly efficient new technology: metal. These newcomers, the inheritors of the Beaker legacy, did not merely occupy the land. They claimed it as a divine trust, an asset to be exploited for the one thing that mattered above all others: the shimmering, deadly allure of bronze itself. The transition was immediate and brutal. Where the Neolithic world prized collective effort and shared ceremonial spaces, the Bronze Age elite demanded singular, undeniable recognition. It was a shift from community power to individual status, a change written in the very graves they dug and the tools they wielded, and it defined the next 2,000 years of history. Bronze was not cheap. It was, in fact, the most valuable commodity the island had ever encountered, requiring a complex and dangerous logistics chain to even exist. This alloy was a logistical nightmare, demanding two separate and geographically distant resources to create the desired material strength. You needed copper, extracted painfully from the harsh, wet hills of places like the Great Orme in North Wales, or ferried across the treacherous sea from deep mines in Ireland. But copper alone was brittle. It was only slightly better than a hardened stone axe. Certainly not worth overthrowing an entire civilization for. No, the true power came from the truly elusive component, the key to the alloy's lethal strength: tin. Tin was the bottleneck, the substance that separated a mere copper-wielding barbarian from a true Bronze Age king. In Britain, tin meant Cornwall, a rugged, isolated peninsula suddenly elevated to the status of a resource superpower, the gateway to unimaginable wealth and power that fueled the nascent elite. The routes established to move these raw materials, the heavy, green copper ingots and the small, dark lumps of tin, were not just trade routes. They were arteries of empire, defended fiercely by those who controlled their choke points. The movement of metal required unprecedented organization, forming alliances and creating enemies in equal measure, fueling constant low-level warfare over access and taxation. This new wealth accumulation demanded new visibility. If you were a chieftain in the nascent early Bronze Age, your power could no longer be subtly implied through kinship ties or ancestral memory. It had to be shouted from the grave, a permanent, physical declaration of dominance over the landscape. This is the era of the great round barrows, man-made hills dedicated not to the collective dead, but to the glorification of a single, powerful man, often surrounded by his personal arsenal and treasures, sealing his legacy in earth and stone forever. Imagine the spectacle required, a monumental effort diverting dozens of laborers for months just to create an eternal, towering monument to one man's ego, marking his lineage and his claim over the surrounding fertile lands. These barrows dotted the ridges and skylines, standing like silent, defiant sentinels, broadcasting a clear, chilling message to anyone who passed. We rule here. Our power is permanent and undeniable.
Inside these earthen tombs lay the proof of this sudden, stratified wealth. The finely crafted gold rings, the polished jet necklaces, another sign of long-distance, high-status trade linking the island from north to south, but most critically, the bronze daggers and axe heads.
These were not just tools, they were badges of office, instruments of lethal authority, often exquisitely decorated with geometric patterns and secured with rivets of almost artistic quality, reflecting the hours of specialized labor required to create them and the inherent value of the material itself. The smith, the bronzesmith, became the most critical artisan in this new, violent world. He was no longer just a craftsman. He was a magical figure, capable of turning dull, heavy rock into shimmering implements of war and prestige, a technological demigod whose skills were priceless. He held the secrets of the alloy, the precise mixture of 90% copper and 10% tin that gave bronze its superior edge and resilience, making it a material that could hold a devastatingly sharp edge and withstand the shock of battle. This technical knowledge was power, guarded fiercely, creating a new class of specialized labor, divorced entirely from the agrarian life that sustained everyone else. The demand for their product drove violence in an endless, terrifying cycle. Bronze weapons meant successful raiding, which meant more captive labor and more seized wealth, which meant greater access to the resources needed to make more bronze weapons for the next raid. It was a chilling feedback loop of escalating aggression, a race for military supremacy that redefined survival itself. Warfare shifted dramatically from sporadic tribal skirmishes using crude stone implements to organized, lethal encounters dictated by the sharpness of a bronze spear tip or the crushing force of a heavy, socketed axe. The very nature of death in Britain became faster, cleaner, and undeniably more final, favoring the man with the better alloy and the thicker armor. As the early Bronze Age matured, certain regional power blocks emerged, none more famous or influential than the so-called Wessex culture. This was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense, but a powerful, interconnected network of chieftains operating across the chalk downs of southern England, perfectly positioned to control the flow of goods from the coastlines inland. They were the gatekeepers, the middlemen who grew astonishingly wealthy by taxing the passage of Irish gold, Welsh copper, and Cornish tin as it moved toward continental Europe or was redistributed across the island. Their graves are the most opulent of the era, reflecting an almost obsessive demand for imported materials and unique high-status artifacts designed purely to signify untouchable status. Think of the legendary Bush Barrow Burial, located strategically near Stonehenge, a monumental grave containing a gold-studded dagger handle, 2 elaborate bronze axes, and a magnificent diamond-shaped gold plate designed to catch the sun. This was the funeral of a true king, a man who commanded legions and controlled economies, proving that the spiritual center established by the Neolithic people was now firmly in the hands of the wealthy, violent, metal-wielding elite.
The great stone still stood, a testament to an ancient, lost past, but the people who now walked their perimeter were utterly changed, driven by ambition and the cold, hard gleam of the world's first true supermaterial. The age of stone was forgotten, swept away in a bloody tide. The age of bronze was ruling the island with an iron, or rather a copper and tin fist, and it was demanding blood sacrifice for its continued prosperity.
The dust settled, but the ground was still shaking from the colossal impact of the Beaker people. These were not just immigrants, they were conquerors, genetic dynamos who had rewritten the destiny of an entire island nation in the span of perhaps 5 swift generations, extinguishing the bloodlines of the Neolithic people who had lived there for 4,000 years. The native darkness of the old world, the quiet farmers, and the solemn builders of the long barrows found themselves serving a new, brutal, and technologically terrifying master, a regime that prized mobility, violence, and the shimmering beauty of wealth.
The initial, terrifying shock of the invasion soon gave way to the chilling permanence of occupation, where the structures of the new society were built upon the graves of the old, cemented by the very commodity that gave them their name, bronze. What truly sealed the fate of the indigenous inhabitants was the secret, the terrifying, almost magical knowledge of how to turn dull, unassuming rock into glittering, deadly metal.
The complex process of mining, smelting, and alloying copper with the precious, rare tin was power absolute, a dark alchemy that only the newcomers understood, creating a technological gulf that no amount of fighting spirit could ever bridge. Tin, the essential hardening agent that transformed pliable copper into durable bronze, was the golden ticket, a strategic resource found only in select, often treacherous locations, particularly in the deep, western corners of the land, places like Cornwall and Devon.
The Beaker elites quickly realized that whoever controlled the flow of tin controlled the very levers of the New World Order, creating vast trade routes that were not merely paths of commerce, but literal veins of pure, terrifying geopolitical dominance, defended by fearsome warriors, clad in leather armor and armed with their terrifying new daggers and fighting axes. This was the birth of the supply chain as a weapon, a chokehold on civilization itself.
The social structure of Britain flipped instantly, violently, and permanently, rejecting the ancient traditions of egalitarian farming communities that had defined the Neolithic era for millennia. Gone were the communal burials, the silent, shared history of the people deposited in their great collective tombs. Now it was all about me, the individual chieftain, the singular warrior,
the man who stood tallest among the graves.
These new rulers demanded to be buried not with their community, but alone, in solitary mounds of earth that clawed upward toward the sky, known now as round barrows, each one a monument to a single ego and a violent life. They were surrounded by the spoils of their personal power and their violence: beautiful flared Beaker pottery, polished jet buttons, wrist guards indicating their prowess as archers, and most importantly, the bronze daggers, sharp and unforgiving symbols of their capacity to take life. Every single burial mound raised across the landscape was a screaming declaration of personal sovereignty, a tangible sign that the old ways of collective responsibility had been ruthlessly murdered and replaced by the cult of the heroic, wealthy individual. The sheer weight of these hoards of grave goods demonstrates a massive concentration of wealth, something the quiet Neolithic world had never truly known. But the true engine of this metallic new economy wasn't solely warfare or grave hoarding. It was massive, industrialized production. The Bronze Age required raw materials in staggering, unprecedented quantities, and the primary currency of this glittering new world was the standardized bronze axe head. These axe heads, often of the flat axe variety, were not necessarily tools intended for felling trees, though they could do so. They were first and foremost units of wealth, status symbols, and objects designed specifically for ritualistic destruction, often thrown into rivers or buried in huge, secretive hoards, creating an artificial scarcity that drove the value of the remaining metal ever higher. This deliberate act of ritual deposition, hoarding and destruction, was a form of economic manipulation, ensuring that the labor required to mine and smelt the ore remained highly valued and constantly in demand, keeping the lower classes perpetually subservient to the metal-owning elite. Imagine the vast, unseen network of prospectors, deep miners, high-heat smelters, and expert smiths, all operating under the rigid, terrifying control of the Beaker warlords. Their mandate was simple and absolute: ensure that the supply of the lifeblood metal never faltered, even as they drained the very earth dry of its mineral wealth. The landscape itself began to reflect this seismic shift in ideology. Even the sacred geometry of the land bowed before the Beaker tide. Those colossal monuments of the Neolithic age, places like the great earthworks of Avebury and the magnificent Stonehenge itself, which had stood for millennia as the absolute centers of communal faith and cosmological observation, began a chilling, slow decline into irrelevance. They weren't usually destroyed by violence, but they were ignored, slowly slipping into the realm of ancient, inconvenient memory, deemed too large, too collective, too Neolithic for the individualistic, militaristic New Age that valued the small, personal monument over the grand, shared earthwork. The new rituals were smaller, more intimate, often focused on the graves of the newly powerful ancestors or the potent, gleaming river sources and marshlands where sacrifices of meticulously crafted bronze objects were offered to appease the demanding earth spirits, tribute for the metals they had stolen from the ground. The open, communal landscape of the past was suddenly segmented, divided by increasingly visible field boundaries, stock enclosures, and defended farmsteads, reflecting the new, harsh reality. This was a land of ownership, of fences, of managed resources, and of constant underlying threat from neighboring chieftains.
The initial shock of the invasion had given way to a chilling, self-sustaining stability. The descendants of the Beaker conquerors settled into a permanent, rigid hierarchy. The specialized warriors and chieftains at the top, the essential, high-status skilled smiths below them, and the vast, silent majority, the absorbed and subjugated descendants of the indigenous farmers at the very bottom, performing the back-breaking agricultural labor that fed the entire, glittering, metal-obsessed machine.
Britain was no longer an island of quiet farmers looking up at the stars. It was a factory floor, a vast, complex military garrison, and a treasure chest, all ruled by men who carried the potent, deadly genetic signature of continental Europe in their very blood. The Great Bronze Age had begun its long, terrifying reign, an era of unprecedented wealth and sudden, shocking violence, and its subjects would soon learn that the price of progress was eternal, exhausting vigilance, and sometimes the ultimate, blood-soaked tribute. The dust of the great genetic reckoning had finally begun to settle across the sodden plains of Britain, but the silence was far more terrifying than the screams. The newcomers, the inheritors of this isolated island, did not merely occupy the land. They systematically reorganized the very concept of power, building a terrifying new world founded on the glittering promise of metal. They brought with them not just the tools for carving history, but the intricate, invisible blueprints for controlling who got to hold those tools and who would simply serve the wielders. Bronze. It wasn't just an alloy. It was the sacred currency of status, survival, and sudden, brutal death. The secret lay in the formula: 1 part tin, 9 parts copper, a delicate and lethal prescription that instantly fractured the egalitarian past, establishing a hierarchy as rigid and sharp as the weapons they forged. Copper was relatively easier to source, particularly from the vast dark seams of Ireland, which suddenly became the New World's most vital resource hub, a treacherous voyage across the churning seas away from the main settlements. But the true bottleneck, the true kingmaker, was the tin. This rare, silvery element, often found in the gravels and rivers of the deep southwest, specifically Cornwall and the isolated hills of Devon, was the ingredient that separated a soft, useless ornament from a razor-sharp, battle-ready axe of supreme deadly efficiency. To control the Bronze Age meant controlling the logistics of the elements with iron-fisted discipline. Imagine the journey. Small, terrifyingly vulnerable boats crossing the tempestuous Irish Sea, then moving along treacherous coastal routes, laden with heavy copper ingots, navigating fog and hidden reefs, constantly watched by rivals who understood the catastrophic value of their fragile cargo. These were not casual traders searching for a profitable bargain. They were armed, organized corporate armies managing supply chains that spanned hundreds of miles, a complex feat of organization and protection unknown to the old, simple Neolithic world that lay shattered beneath their feet.
Every ingot, every shimmering axe head cast in the flickering, dangerous light of the furnace, represented an investment measured not just in labor, but in blood, sweat, and strategic intimidation that had to be maintained through constant vigilance. The sacred trade routes weren't marked by standing stones or signposts. They were invisibly marked by the graves of those who tried to steal what rightfully belonged to the rising elite, a chilling warning to anyone who considered piracy.
This new economy, built on scarcity and logistics, birthed a terrifying new social structure: the specialized metallurgist warrior, men of dual, terrifying purpose. No longer was a farmer just a farmer who sometimes fought. Now, the man who knew how to turn dull rock into a shining, lethal weapon possessed power that transcended tribal boundaries and ancient loyalties. He was simultaneously the master engineer, the spiritual intermediary who commanded the elemental fires of transformation, and the frontline soldier who was tasked with protecting his irreplaceable assets with extreme prejudice. These men, cloaked in the absolute authority of their superior technology, formed the bedrock of the early Bronze Age aristocracy, demanding tribute and respect from all lesser classes.
Their identity was literally fused with the metal they crafted and displayed, showing off their wealth openly through highly polished, sometimes impractical objects, massive, heavy display axes, and intricate gold and amber jewelry that screamed a single, terrifying message to the subservient populace: I have absolute resources, and you do not, and dare not challenge me.
The ultimate expression of this overwhelming new power wasn't just in using the metal to kill. It was in the deliberate, systematic wasting of it. Why bury thousands of pounds of irreplaceable, life-saving bronze deep into the cold earth, often snapped, ruined, or deliberately broken into useless pieces? The great hoards, archaeological treasure troves found scattered across the landscape like discarded gods' toys, were not just forgotten caches of lost goods waiting for recovery. They were calculated acts of profound social cruelty and divine communication, a form of ultimate, terrifying theater. They were the ultimate flex, the unwritten message broadcast clearly to the common people struggling for mere survival. Our wealth is so boundless, our control so absolute, that we can afford to destroy what you desperately need to survive. It was a ritual of conspicuous, chilling destruction designed only to solidify the perceived legitimacy of the ruling class and remind everyone else of their permanent, inferior, and disposable place in the new order. Look closer at the final resting places of these new lords of the Bronze Age. Gone entirely are the communal cairns of the Neolithic ancestors, the vast shared chambers where the history of the entire tribe was interwoven in death. Now, the powerful dead lie alone, deliberately segregated, each within their own monumental barrow, a defiant mound of earth demanding individual, perpetual remembrance that dominated the horizon. And what accompanied them into the perpetual darkness of the grave? Not simple seeds or crude flint tools, but the full panoply of their earthly dominance, the perfect, highly polished battle axe, the intricate gold earrings, the fine imported amber beads from the distant, mysterious Baltic region, and the ubiquitous, finely crafted Beaker pottery that announced their superior lineage and their irreversible victory. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age was a shocking shift from decentralized skirmish to institutionalized, formalized warfare, driven entirely by economic goals and the protection of resources. The weapons themselves changed the entire game, altering the parameters of conflict forever. Imagine facing a stone axe, which requires massive force and close proximity to injure, versus a bronze rapier, a sleek, thrusting instrument designed specifically for piercing human flesh with cold, efficient brutality from a safe distance. This wasn't merely a technological upgrade. It was a brutal psychological weapon that redefined the meaning of combat. It signaled the arrival of true warrior specialists, men whose entire existence revolved around the maintenance of their costly personal arsenal and the ruthless, immediate enforcement of the new Bronze Law. Their job was simple, terrifying, and essential to the ruling class. Protect the flow of copper, secure the seams of tin, and ensure that the tribute flowed upward to the elites who guaranteed their technological superiority and continued dominance. The price of this terrifying new peace? Absolute, unquestioning submission to the men who controlled the destiny-altering metal, or a swift death by that very metal. The promise of power was intoxicating, but the execution of that power required a deadly, fragile alchemy. Bronze, that golden key to dominion, was not merely copper. It required tin, the rarest, most elusive, and geographically specific substance on the entire island chain. Without tin, copper was soft, easily bent, and ultimately useless against a sharpened flint axe. The Beaker warlords understood this brutal truth. Their dominance was mathematically dependent on accessing the few, distant veins of white gold. Archaeological evidence screams that the initial push was not for farmland, but for the mineral maps held deep within the memories of the surviving indigenous people, or perhaps through divine luck and relentless exploration. The search for tin immediately dictated the geography of the new regime. Suddenly, the desolate, storm-swept moorlands of Cornwall and Devon became the most valuable real estate in the known world. This was the terrifying engine room of the British Bronze Age. Imagine the savage expeditions, small groups of armed men guided by desperate, fearful locals, hacking their way through ancient forests, searching for the telltale signs of alluvial deposits or the exposed seams in the granite rock faces. Every ounce of tin dug from the cold earth was equivalent to 1,000 years of Neolithic toil, an instant multiplier of force and status. The supply lines themselves were a massive undertaking, weaving perilous paths from the far southwest across the hostile Central Plains, all the way back to the emerging centers of metallurgical production in Wessex and the Thames Valley. These routes, these ancient trackways, became the very arteries of power, policed by men who knew that if the flow of tin stopped, their divine right to rule would crumble into soft, impotent copper dust. Controlling the ore was merely the start of this dangerous game. Transforming it required something far more specialized than simple brute force: knowledge. This era saw the terrifying emergence of the metallurgist, the master smith, who was simultaneously scientist, priest, and arms dealer. He was the one who knew the precise ratio, 9 parts copper, 1 part tin, to create the perfect, deadly alloy that could cleave stone and bone alike. These were the true kings, not the warriors who wielded the blades, but the men who commanded the furnace and the crucibles. Their workshops were sacred, shrouded in smoke and taboo, places where the raw earth was transformed into destiny. They held the secret of the mold, the knowledge of tempering, the sacred ritual of the casting process, a terrifying monopoly of industrial knowledge that gave them unimaginable leverage over the fighting elite. The archaeological record doesn't just show genetic replacement. It shows a staggering intensification of status obsession. We move abruptly from the collective, communal burials of the Neolithic, the long barrows where community mattered most, to the singular, terrifying statement of the Beaker burial mound, the tumulus. These weren't graves. They were geological monuments to an individual's overwhelming, divine right to rule. Underneath those carefully constructed earthworks lay the proof of their supremacy, the artifacts that screamed of their success and savagery. The body, often contracted or resting on a bed of carefully selected stones, was surrounded not by basic pottery, but by the physical manifestations of their power. Fine, imported flint daggers that required incredible skill. Rare gold ornaments, which begin to appear in the record like flashes of divine fire. And, of course, the full toolkit of the conquering warrior. The Beaker pottery itself, while foundational to the culture's name, was often secondary to the true status symbols. The V-perforated jet buttons sourced from distant Whitby, the intricate bone belt hooks, and the magnificent, perfectly crafted arrowheads that signified proficiency in the hunt, and, more importantly, in war. But the centerpiece, the undeniable declaration of authority, was the weapon. Early copper axes, the first objects of mass-produced metal, were quickly followed by the development of the flat axe, and then the revolutionary flange axe, designed for insertion into a wooden haft, creating a far more lethal tool, that would eventually lead to the development of the sword itself. These were not tools for chopping wood. They were instruments of judgment, polished, revered, and buried only with the most potent leaders, ensuring their status carried over into the next terrifying existence. This concentration of wealth and power led directly to the geographical crystallization of the early Bronze Age elite, the Wessex culture. We are talking about the area surrounding Stonehenge and Avebury, regions already sanctified by megalithic ancestors, but now violently repurposed for a new, metal-driven aristocracy whose power radiated outward like a shockwave. Why Wessex? Proximity to the trading nexus, superb agricultural land to feed their retinue, and a central location that allowed them to manage the influx of both copper, often sourced from Ireland or Wales, and the absolutely vital tin from the southwest. The wealth flowing through these few hands was astronomical, allowing them to engage in truly long-distance trade. Suddenly, Britain was no longer a peripheral agrarian island. It was a crucial node in a vast European metal network, trading raw materials for finished goods, exchanging their precious tin for amber from the North Sea, and ultimately accumulating prestige that cemented their tyrannical hold. This relentless influx of resources required constant defense and even more ruthless expansion. The fragile peace established by the initial conquest was perpetually maintained only by the explicit, terrifying threat of superior weaponry. Every neighboring tribe, every surviving pocket of Neolithic resistance, saw the dazzling array of bronze and understood the crushing impossibility of fighting it. The Bronze Age wasn't just a time of technological advancement. It was the age of consolidated, centralized, and utterly ruthless economic warfare. The ground rules were chillingly simple: pay tribute or be eliminated. And the tribute was always, always measured in the white metal of destiny, that glittering, fatal key called tin. The new regime, forged in the crucible of genetic conquest, understood one terrifying truth: control the supply, control the world. The copper deposits were relatively widespread, a basic commodity found across the island, useful but not decisive. But tin, that shimmering silvery metal that transformed soft copper into the lethal, ringing alloy of bronze, that was the bottleneck, the ultimate key to power and destruction.
Without tin, the new weapons were useless trinkets, easily bent and discarded. With it, they became instruments of swift, brutal dominance, capable of slicing through stone axes and bone shields with terrifying ease. This scarcity meant the entire fate of Bronze Age Britain rested on the geological luck of one tiny corner of the land. That corner, the mythical source of endless, fatal wealth, was the rugged, mist-shrouded peninsula now known as Cornwall and Western Devon. Here, the cassiterite ore, the oxide of tin, was pushed up through the granite, often found in alluvial deposits that could be meticulously panned or dug from shallow streambeds, a secret whispered only among the highest echelon of the Beaker successors.
To possess Cornwall was to possess the means to arm an empire, to create a monopoly that no opposing chieftain could ever hope to break. And so, the great internal conflicts of early Bronze Age Britain were fundamentally wars of logistical control. Battles fought not just for land, but for the muddy, wet access to those rich stream beds. Mining the tin was a brutal, dehumanizing task. It demanded endless, back-breaking labor, often done by those remnants of the Neolithic populations who had been subjugated, forced into debt slavery, or captured in the swift, surgical raids launched by the burgeoning Bronze Barons. Imagine the scene: cold, perpetual dampness, workers waist-deep in freezing water, panning heavy, sharp gravel, searching desperately for the glint of the white metal. Every ounce of tin extracted cost blood, sweat, and sometimes life, crushed beneath unstable pits or drowned in flash floods that swept down the rugged terrain. These workers were expendable cogs in a machine designed purely for elite profit and strategic superiority. Their desperate labor fueled the ascendancy of a metal-wielding aristocracy. Once extracted, the tin ore, heavy, precious, and fiercely guarded, began its perilous journey. This was the legendary Tin Trail, a series of clandestine, heavily protected routes snaking eastward from the Cornish coast. The transport was itself a vast, complex military operation, requiring layers of guards, swift pack animals, and strict secrecy. Every mile of the trail was fraught with danger. Rival tribes attempting ambushes, desperate bandits hoping to steal a load that could buy them instant kingship, and the constant threat of nature itself, sweeping away cargo and carriers alike. The tin moved like liquid gold, irreplaceable and lethal in its value. These caravans eventually terminated at the great ceremonial and manufacturing centers, most famously the burgeoning power nexus in Wessex near the Salisbury Plain. This was where the alchemy happened, where the magic, or perhaps the dark science, of bronze production was mastered and meticulously controlled. The process itself was a profound act of transformation, requiring immense skill and knowledge. Copper and tin were carefully measured, usually in a ratio approximating 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, though the formula varied depending on the desired hardness and application. The metals were melted down in clay crucibles, subjected to temperatures high enough to turn rock into running liquid, usually in specialized furnaces built specifically for this purpose. The resulting molten alloy was then poured into intricate molds carved from stone or clay, shaping the metal into the symbols of the new age: the flanged axe, the deadly dagger, and the swift spear tip. When the bronze cooled, it didn't just harden, it acquired a profound, intimidating resonance. It rang with a clear, sharp sound when struck, a noise that must have sounded like the voice of the gods to those who had only ever heard the dull thud of a stone axe. This resonance symbolized its superiority, its cutting edge, both literally and figuratively. The Bronze Barons, the inheritors of the Beaker legacy, used this technological monopoly not just for warfare, but for profound social stratification. Bronze items were almost exclusively grave goods for the elite, status symbols that denoted untouchable wealth and inherited power. They weren't common tools. They were the regalia of a warrior aristocracy. The man who possessed a beautifully crafted bronze dagger, its surface gleaming and its edges razor-sharp, commanded immediate respect, or rather demanded instant submission. This weapon was a physical testament to his control over the distant tin mines, the protected trade routes, and the secret knowledge of the metallurgists. The common folk, the farmers, the herdsmen, the workers who tilled the fields and sustained the settlements, still primarily relied on bone, wood, and stone tools. They watched from a distance, perhaps catching a terrifying glimpse of a bronze axe head flashing in the sun as the elite rode past, a constant, chilling reminder of the military disparity that held their world in check. This was the true onset of the Bronze Age, not a gradual transition, but a sudden, violent entrenchment of a new, metal-based hierarchy. It was a world split decisively between those who commanded the white metal of destiny and those who were commanded by the superior force it created. The stage was set for the construction of monuments that reflected this extreme concentration of wealth and power. The physical manifestation of the Tin Baron's unassailable reign over the island. The transition from the old ways was not subtle. It was a physical, back-breaking reorganization of the very soil of Britain. The Beaker lords, now firmly established as the new aristocracy, demanded more than just modest burial mounds. They demanded monuments that screamed their permanence, their dominion, and their unassailable connection to the cosmos. Their wealth, distilled from the copper mines of Ireland and the terrifyingly rare tin supplies of Cornwall, gave them the leverage, the sheer slave power needed to complete projects the indigenous Neolithic farmers could only dream of. The old magic of the ancestral sites, like Stonehenge, needed a radical, terrifying upgrade, a brutal final phase dictated by the new masters of the island. Stonehenge was the ultimate target. For 1,000 years, it had been a complex, evolving, but relatively modest site, tied intimately to the local land and the ebb and flow of ancestral memory. Now, under the iron grip of the emerging Wessex culture elite, it exploded into its final, most recognizable form, the colossal Sarsen Circle. These were not the gentle, easily managed blue stones of the Welsh mountains. These were gigantic, 30-foot-high, 20-ton slabs of Sarsen rock, dragged agonizingly from the Marlborough Downs, a perilous journey of over 20 miles across uneven terrain. Imagine the sheer, terrifying logistics required, the hundreds of miles of worn rope, the thousands of oxen straining in their yokes, and the constant, rhythmic sound of the whips cracking over the backs of the dispossessed, the conquered laborers forced to move mountains for their new, untouchable masters. The historical narrative often sanitizes this cost,
But this was a totalitarian act of engineering. It required an extreme centralization of command, a brutal efficiency, and a surplus of resources and labor that only a metal-rich economy, a Bronze Age oligarchy, could enforce and maintain.
Every single stone placed, every massive lintel wrestled onto the top of the uprights, was a silent but resounding monument not just to the sun and the stars, but to the unstoppable, unrelenting power of the Tin Barons, the wealthiest men Britain had ever known.
They didn't just place the stones haphazardly. They painstakingly dressed them, using stone balls and heavy hammers to smooth the surfaces, perfecting the geometry and achieving a finish previously unimaginable. Then came the true stroke of engineered genius, or perhaps engineered cruelty: mortise and tenon joints, a highly sophisticated carpentry technique usually reserved for timber, applied to rocks weighing 40 tons.
This ensured that the structure would stand for millennia, a perpetual physical reminder of who held the ultimate celestial and temporal power over the land. This calculated precision was entirely deliberate. It legitimized the new rule in the eyes of the masses.
If the lords could command the sun and the stone with such accuracy, if they could harness the very elements to create such perfect geometry, their authority was surely divine, granted directly by the fierce gods of the bronze and the deep earth.
This era marks the definitive emergence of the Wessex culture, a label that describes not just a geographical location, but the ultimate, most decadent expression of the British Bronze Age aristocracy. While the rest of Britain was slowly adjusting to basic copper axes and simple tools, the Wessex elite were quite literally dripping in gold and imported Baltic amber. Their burial mounds, often situated strategically within direct sight of the towering Sarsen Circle, were not simple graves. They were treasure vaults designed to intimidate and awe any future generation. We often speak of the Amesbury archer, the immigrant whose arrival helped kick off this genetic revolution. But his descendants became something far grander, far more terrifying in their unimaginable opulence. Artifacts recovered from these barrows, like the phenomenal Bush Barrow gold lozenge, the finest piece of prehistoric metalwork ever found on the island, testify to this extreme and sudden stratification of wealth. It wasn't just metal, it was geometrically perfect gold, intricately worked, a signifier that these individuals did not merely possess wealth. They possessed the very cosmic secrets of mathematical order and divine favor. But the monuments weren't only about stone and gold, reserved for the select few. They were about the comprehensive control of the many. Adjacent to Stonehenge, the massive Timberhenge of Durrington Walls and the smaller satellite structure of Woodhenge tell a different, more visceral and unsettling story about Bronze Age life. While Stonehenge was the exclusive, permanent, and intimidating stone temple of the elite, Durrington Walls was the temporary, often chaotic, feasting ground of the forced labor and the lower tiers of society, brought in for massive, state-sponsored rituals and work camps.
Archaeological evidence unearthed there suggests gargantuan feasting events, thousands upon thousands of slaughtered pigs consumed over a single, overwhelming period. The greasy remains scattered deep within the post holes of the massive timber circle. This was a classic strategy of authoritarian control, periodic, overwhelming spectacle, accompanied by the forced redistribution of protein to keep the working class compliant, energized, and forever motivated, bound by the intense, unforgettable memory of the immense communal feast.
It was the Bronze Age equivalent of bread and circuses, a terrifying display of logistical power, where the elite organized the world's largest, most controlled barbecue, solidifying their non-negotiable role as the indispensable providers, the only source of such plenty. The Bronze Age lords fundamentally changed the very relationship between humanity and the sky. Neolithic people revered the ancestors and the slow, cyclical renewal of the earth. The Beaker elite cared primarily about the path of the sun and the intimidating perfection of time, the things that enabled celestial navigation, long-distance trade, and the precise timing of their immense centralized construction projects. Stonehenge, with its newly fixed precise alignment to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset, became a gigantic, terrifyingly fixed celestial clock, confirming the elite's mastery over the seasons and, crucially, over the agricultural calendar that fed their colossal workforce. If the sun rose exactly where they predicted, if they could mathematically prove their divine connection to the celestial engine, then their lineage was truly blessed, their political authority utterly unchallengeable. This was the ultimate ideological weapon, the physical control of time itself, manifested in permanent, giant, carved stone. The focus shifted entirely from communal burial chambers, the long barrows of the fading Neolithic past, to the solitary, dramatic spectacle of the round barrow. Every prominent hill within the Wessex landscape was crowned with the grave of a single, powerful man, or maybe an extremely privileged couple, but never the community as a whole. This was the final statement of entrenched individualism, of aggressive wealth hoarding, and of the ultimate power trip. The Bronze Age was defined by its enduring materials, bronze, gold, and the engineered stone monuments that were designed to last until the end of time, enshrining the memories of the few who had commanded the terrifying flow of the metal. The island was no longer a scattering of self-sufficient, low-power tribes. It was now a highly structured, violently stratified society, obsessed with material goods and the visible, crushing demonstration of wealth, setting the stage for the dramatic, terrifying expansion of trade that would define the next 1,000 years of the British story. The weather turned against them with biblical vengeance. The autumn rains came, turning the camp into a sea of viscous, disease-ridden mud. Then winter descended upon them like a freezing, suffocating shroud. A relentless cold they were utterly unprepared to face after the desert crossing. The knights, the nobility of Europe, the proudest warriors of the West, were reduced to miserable, shivering infantry, their status dissolving into the freezing mud. Their armor, once a symbol of prestige, now felt like a cage of ice. The famine reached catastrophic levels. Men stopped praying for victory and started praying for death, just to end the cold, agonizing emptiness in their stomachs. The princes, starved and furious, began turning on each other, their bitter rivalries boiling over the empty cooking pots. Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond fought openly, not over tactics, but over who would claim ownership of Antioch if they ever somehow managed to breach its walls. The common soldiers saw the sickening hypocrisy, their leaders arguing over territory while they ate roots and boiled leather. The most devastating blow, however, came not from the impenetrable walls of Antioch, but from within the ranks of the supposed leaders. Stephen of Blois, a man who had sworn the most sacred oath to God in Clermont, finally broke. He was a brilliant letter writer, a man of refined tastes, but a spectacular failure as a true warrior. He looked at the endless frozen siege, the dying men, and the insurmountable walls, and his aristocratic resolve finally crumbled into dust and despair. Convinced the entire Christian enterprise was a hopeless catastrophe ordained for destruction, he made the decision that would forever stain his name. He deserted. He packed his bags, took his remaining retinue, and fled back toward the relative safety of Constantinople.
His departure was not just the loss of troops. It was a devastating dagger plunged into the heart of morale. It signaled to the entire watching world that the great Christian crusade was failing, and the leaders themselves were abandoning the cause to die in the frozen ditch.
This act of calculated cowardice had immediate, terrifying consequences. On his flight, Stephen encountered the massive Sultanic Relief Army, an unprecedented Islamic force led by the legendary commander Kerboga, roaring toward Antioch to wipe the Crusaders off the map. Stephen of Blois, seeing his chance to justify his desertion, lied to Kerboga, claiming the Crusaders were already defeated, decimated, and on the verge of total collapse. This monumental lie bought Kerboga time, making him slow his approach, believing the starving invaders were no longer a threat. It was the greatest military mistake Kerboga would ever make, but at the time, it looked like the final bitter end for the Crusaders. They were caught between the immovable city and the unstoppable Islamic army barreling down on them. But even in this darkest hour, a flicker of wicked, desperate opportunity emerged. The walls of Antioch were strong, yes, but its defense ultimately relied on men. Men who, like the Crusaders, were susceptible to gold and fear and the corrosive power of betrayal. Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz,
an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yaghi-Siyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties.
The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind, a guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal.
The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.